Welcome to the American Intelligence Media. I'm your host, Douglas Gabriel, and today we're speaking with Michael McKibben of Leader Technology about the theft of his invention by Facebook. This is an amazing story. Most of us have heard a little bit about it on the news, and every time you turn around, Mark Zuckerberg has to pay somebody off who he was involved with at Harvard University, where he supposedly created Facebook. We have Michael McKibben who can tell us the true story of how it actually came to pass, with all the details, which were derived from depositions and lawyers and all kinds of amazing work he's done for the last 17 years trying to defend his own invention. What I want to do, though, is to make sure that I get the words right, and so I have a prepared statement I wish to read for you. Many people were aware that Mark Zuckerberg has had to settle out of court again and again over his theft of the social network that he called Facebook. What they don't know, perhaps, is that Zuckerberg was one of the fake tech lords who got his invention from James Chandler and Larry Sumner's efforts to apply technology they stole from Leader Technology that was being disseminated through the IBM Eclipse Foundation. Zuckerberg is obviously a fake who admits that he does not write code anymore. Okay. The supposed greatest code writer of all times doesn't write code. He's not even interested in writing code anymore. And now, when he's questioned, he appears to know little about any of the code that was written in the hundreds of thousands of lines of code that created Facebook. He doesn't seem to know anything about it when he's asked. Very, very telling. Also, Zuckerberg is obviously a front man, but he's not a good one, because there's chinks in his armor. He's falling down every time he opens his mouth, and we're finding out more and more that he has very, very little to do with Facebook, even at this point, let alone being the man who invented it. The confused stories Zuckerberg tells about Facebook can be made sense of when they are told by the true inventor, Michael McKibben, who did write the code for the greatest software advancement of our time. Talking with Michael about the source code will reveal that he is the true inventor if anyone takes the time to do so. We recommend that Mark Zuckerberg and Michael McKibben go into a public debate that is shown worldwide so that they can discuss the program and the code, so it will become quite obvious that Mark Zuckerberg had little to do with it except botching every step of the way. Michael McKibben continues to assess his legal options after discovering just how deep the corruption actually went in terms of the theft of his trade secrets and his invention. He also communicates with others from whom Zuckerberg and his CIA compatriots have also stolen material for decades. Matter of fact, these lawsuits still go on, and he's going to tell us about those today. So it's never ended. Mark Zuckerberg said that he created Facebook. He didn't create Facebook. He had all kinds of insider trading involved, and everyone who seemed to have been involved with him at Harvard has sued him, and in most cases they have won. So it's pretty obvious what's really going on here. So we are so fortunate to have Michael with us today. And so, Michael, can you tell us the true story of Facebook and how it actually happened, seeing that you are the one who invented social network, and that the time that you invented it, Mark Zuckerberg was still in high school, and you spent tens of millions of dollars on this project, lots of shareholders, lots of people working with you, and incredible effort. You've also shown that you had patents and you did this type of work before, during, and afterwards. So you're the real deal. We've demonstrated that already by our conversations with you. So can you tell us the true story that isn't being told about how Mark Zuckerberg was connected to Facebook?
Well, one of the challenges you have when you talk about anything related to Facebook is there's a tremendous amount of false information that's put out by the media about Facebook. So they've had a lot of support for the stories they tell. And probably everybody remembers the Social Network movie where they put out the idea that he developed it in a couple weeks, that he was just sort of this bored genius, and it just all magically appeared, and then months later it all went public, and it's all very easy because he's a genius. That has been the public perception, and our observation has been that was quite a powerful perception that most people bought hook, line, and sinker. So when you have that level of disinformation out there, it's really difficult to understand what actually happened. So a number of people, including me, we just started digging. We looked for facts wherever we could find facts, and when facts didn't line up, we said, what's going on here? And so what I'm summarizing now is the fruit of over a decade of information that's come out in little bits and pieces. And it has been in drips. And what we discovered is an entire, I don't know what you call it, a psychological operation or whatever, to fabricate a story, to create a creation story that the public would buy, and that was the Social Network movie. And then there was a book that went along with it called, I can't remember the name of it now, by David Kilpatrick. Oh, The Facebook Effect. That was, and so they pulled out all the stops to get this story right. But as various people, including Zuckerberg, testified in these various court cases you mentioned, the chinks in the armor came out slowly. And so inconsistencies, outright lies. In our case, we tried to get, we tried in our request for information to analyze Facebook's 2003 and 2004 computer hard drives. And for a year, Facebook's attorneys equivocated and would not provide them. And then on the eve, when it looked like the judge was going to provide them, they switched attorneys out and said they lost the information. We now know from court cases later, recently, that there were 28 of these hard drives that were in the possession of Facebook's attorney Gibson Dunn the entire time. And Gibson Dunn magically became the appeals attorney in our case. So there is a lot of this kind of, I don't know what the right word is, obfuscation was going on the whole time. But to summarize what we believe to be the case now, that Facebook, I need to mention something here. In 2001, I created a PowerPoint presentation, an idea for how to implement our new invention, coming out invention, in a university situation. My son had just come to Harvard. He was recruited by the football team and was in pre-med and was at Harvard. And I thought, well, this is a great way to, let's just go to Harvard and do the first implementation of our platform at Harvard. And I suggested to Professor Chandler, who was our patent attorney at the time, that since he had relationships with IBM, that we should do this together with IBM. That was on this PowerPoint. We then presented this PowerPoint to a national laboratory group in Columbus, Ohio, by the name of Battelle Memorial Institute, that actually manages some of our national laboratories. In a meeting, I presented that idea to Battelle and to the people there, that we should try to do this idea. Well, 2 years later, an implementation was presented to the people at Harvard. It was called Facebook and had nothing to do with us. So, and in fact, in the PowerPoint, there's actually Harvard logos. I had the whole thing laid out. So it's clear they copied this idea, and then they recruited Mark Zuckerberg to be the face that they were going to put on this Harvard story. Well, that was in 2001. At the end of 2001, Professor Chandler and actually we thought we were ready to go with the software, and then we ran into a major issue with scalability in our databases, and we basically had to go back to the engineering drawing board to figure this out, and that took another 1.5 years. So it's evident now that they were thinking we were going to get going with our code much earlier than we were. And so during the whole of 2003, we're figuring out what the problem was, which we figured out in October of 2003. So it's clear that Zuckerberg was recruited to basically stall anybody at Harvard that had the idea of a Facebook. And that name Facebook was not even his. The Harvard computer science, not computer science, but the actual administrative group that handled all the computers at Harvard actually had the name that I can see as the first one to suggest it. But there were others that were using the name too. There was a guy by the name of Aaron Greenspan who developed a program called House System. And then the Winklevosses came up with the idea, well, let's do one and we'll call it, they eventually called it Connect You. They had a previous name for it. Can't remember what it was.
Harvard Connect.
Harvard Connect, yes. And then there was another gentleman by the name of Paul Siglia, who was an entrepreneur who found Zuckerberg on Craigslist and wanted to hire him to help him write some code, which he initially called Street Facts, but then said, no, I really want to call it Facebook. So it's really clear that Zuckerberg's task in 2003 was to stall anyone who was going to try to do anything related to a Facebook until we got done with our code. That's obvious now. And a little coincidence, it's now well known because the Social Network movie actually highlighted the scene where on October 28th of 2003, Zuckerberg starts hacking into all the house sites at Harvard. Well, we have in our source code logs of our programmer nodes, so they say what they've done, when they've done it. That happens to be the very night that our lead programmer on the tracking module in the system, when you log on, that tracking module that starts tracking you in the system, when it was fully debugged, was that night. That happens to be the exact night that Zuckerberg wrote in his online diary, let the hacking begin. And so, there's just all these magical coincidences. So it really became, and then he continued to obfuscate with the Winklevosses, with Aaron Greenspan, with Paul Siglia, stalling him, and until they went live on February 4th of 2004. So that's what we believe went down, and that Mark Zuckerberg was a cutout to put in front of Facebook so they would have a story that they could associate with Harvard. But in fact, it was a bunch of Harvard alums in the National Venture Capital Association that were the real people feeding them the coaching and the business ideas that eventually became Facebook.
And then the Winklevosses got a settlement, millions of dollars in a settlement. Did Greenspan get a settlement from Mark?
Interestingly, he got a settlement during our trial, before our trial.
So I think the Winklevosses got what, $26 million or something?
No, I think their settlement was for, $65 million. Part of it was in cash and part of it was in Facebook
Oh, that's
stock.
right, exactly. Yes.
And then they seem to have been offered a position in Bitcoin because they're now big into Bitcoin.
That's right. And then Siglia, who actually has a contract, and could you tell us about him and the way his situation right now, and also the way that you are linking up with that continuing lawsuit?
Paul Siglia is currently on the run. Nobody knows where he is. His story is a treacherous story of persecution, in my opinion. And he was one of those entrepreneurs trying to do something with a Facebook and got in touch with Mark Zuckerberg, and Zuckerberg immediately cut a contract with him for something called Street Facts. And then when he said, well, Street Facts is not really what I'm interested in, I really want to do it with a Facebook, Zuckerberg ran back to him and they altered the contract and added the Facebook. They called it the Facebook back then. Well, to cut a very long story short, the U.S. government has accused Paul Siglia of forgery, that the second contract isn't valid, that it was a forgery. And then Preet Bharara, the U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, actually arrested Paul Siglia and put him in jail. And then that case carried on, and at some point along the way, the attorneys for Siglia, after Siglia realized that he was being set up, he left the country with his family and he's out of the country now, so nobody knows where he is. But they asked me to give them an affidavit which described how Facebook had obfuscated providing Zuckerberg's 2003 and 2004 hard drives in our case as an example of the ongoing fraud that they were also experiencing in their case. So I gave them an affidavit of what happened in our case. And so that's the connection. But in the criminal case now against Paul, they've got a little problem because the prosecutor in that case actually put that contract out to the Secret Service forensic labs, and they came back and said, we can't say this is fraud. And that's where the case stands right now.
Mark could lose half of Facebook over this. Is that correct?
I don't know the details of that, but the contract, the way that it reads, talks about a 50-50 split.
That's what I mean. So 50-50 even before it went public. So he would have the claims to 50% of Facebook. Plus he did write code, and that's been proven, and he was a code writer. That was already proven.
Well, Siegel actually paid Zuckerberg money, which they have, the contracts are the payments are public record. So, I mean, from what I know about contract law, he's got valid issues. I don't know where it's going to end up, but.
Now, these 28 hard drives, during your case, had the lawyers in the other case not hidden these and kept them away from your case and lied and said that they didn't have them, and that the lawyers in your case, I mean, that you were fighting against, said, oh no, we don't have them, we can't get them, but then as soon as your case was over, they popped up again, right?
Yeah, we've only learned recently that they actually exist. And it came through the Siglia case. And as it turns out, those drives were presented to the Winklevoss twins, in their case back in about 2005. And there was an actual inventory of those 28 hard drives. But this was all a record that was sealed, so nobody else knew about it. And so they were put in the custody of his personal lawyer and Gibson Dunn, which is a very large law firm that's historically represented Facebook. So when we began asking for that information in our case, we had some record from the Winklevoss case that something like that may exist, but we didn't have any list. So we asked to see that. We had to see that information. And we filed for motions to compel, and our attorneys were just fighting to get this information. Because obviously if we see this information, it's got Eclipse Foundation on it and our source code on it, then the case is over. And so obviously they didn't want us to see it. So that went on for 8-9 months, and they never once said that it was lost during that whole time they were fighting it. And then when Judge Leonard Stark indicated that he was going to have to let us see them, the Facebook attorneys shifted to a different firm right after that event, to a company called Cooley Godward, which is quite associated with Barack Obama and the energy stimulus, by the way, but that's another story. So Cooley came in and said, oh, gee, golly, we can't find any of these hard drives. We can't find any of this information. So we had to go to trial without ever seeing that information.
It sounds like fraud to me, Michael.
It's fraud on the court. It's very clearly fraud. And now we know it because 2 days after the appeals court in our case, the Federal Circuit, continued to protect Facebook, 2 days after the filings in that case, in the Siglia case, these 28 hard drives magically appear. The ones that they said they lost, they're back.
And we suppose that on those 28 hard drives would be your source code that would 100% prove that you wrote it.
Yes.
And now you have already looked into some of the source code of Facebook, and you know that it is the code that you wrote.
Our experts at trial, before trial, actually looked at the current Facebook source code. And we proved on 11 of 11 claims that Facebook is infringing our patent. That we proved in court. It was a split decision. The judge and the courts started playing around with fabricated evidence. They did not follow clearly defined precedent for how to prove whether or not that the source code was ours, and so basically the courts circle the wagons around Facebook, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court then. So that was the clue. There's something horribly wrong with our senior court system in America.
That's where I was going next. Your case demonstrates the fraud in the judicial system so profoundly, changing judges in the middle of a case, putting someone on
1 month before trial,
who had never even looked at
had never done a patent case.
The fraud is astounding. Now, there's another level of fraud that's going on.
By the way, he had just been nominated a few months earlier by Barack Obama to that seat, and had not actually been confirmed as judge yet, but was confirmed as judge 8 days after our trial was over.
Well, he needed to thank the person who appointed him, because of course we know that Obama was complicit with all of this. Another person that goes all the way back to that 1993 meeting with IBM, when basically they started saying that the government absolutely will control all software, all hardware, all firmware, was Larry Summers, who then magically had been at the World Bank. He became the president of Harvard, and later became the director of the National Economic Council. Very powerful man. He basically ripped off Russia. Well, Harvard was sued for the program that he instituted in Russia and had to pay out. So Larry Summers, all of a sudden, goes from running the World Bank, one of the most powerful banking organizations in the world, comes to Harvard at the exact moment that Harvard is chosen as the place that the largest leap forward, the quantum leap in software in our internet age, happened there.
Isn't that magical?
Is that magical? Was he placed there to make sure this happened? And Uri Milner, who we now know was part of insider trading and later became a mega billionaire over this, took the same software to Russia, and Sheryl Sandberg was there with Larry Summers, Uri Milner, Sheryl Sandberg. They all then hold major positions in all of these things, make billions of dollars. They're controlling massive amounts of money, and it all started at Harvard. Sure looks like a setup to me. And then when you hear Mark Zuckerberg, when he's interviewed, they say, "Mark, how did you invent it?" These are his words. "Well, Harvard didn't have a Facebook, so I made one." That's his entire summary of all the elements of how okay, first off, he said, Harvard didn't have a Facebook. There were no Facebooks, Mark. You can't even say one sentence without revealing that you were given Facebook. As you say, even the name, the Facebook, wasn't his, and that was some of the contention between other people. How would it be set up? What would it look like? What was the name? Who wrote the code? No one knows really who wrote the code except maybe Siglia. We know because he had a contract, might have written some of the code. But these 767 lines of that code were really a construct of Larry Summers, John Podesta, David Kapos, James Chandler, and these same people, and they
were
put Larry
creating
there.
a cutout. It's very obvious. They were creating a cutout at Harvard to create a Harvard story. It was all fake, and it was all part of the plan to develop a system that could then become. These guys were very bright in advertising and internet. A lot of these guys that are associated with them were a part of PayPal. So they had background in what would be interesting to users. And so they had a lot of user information that they wanted to apply to this. So they kind of knew what they wanted in the way of a platform. And so they started using their connections with the underwriters, with the intelligence world, getting the defense contracts, and they knew what they wanted to do. And it's real obvious that Larry Summers was there at Harvard for a time to make sure that Zuckerberg got down his part of it.
So your invention, which was for the freedom of information, turned into a weaponized psyops that was controlled by some of the most powerful people in America. And then it was backed up by judicial fraud, by judicial placement of judges who you knew, well, had you known the judge that you were going before, you would probably know the outcome before you even went into the court.
Right.
So we know this.
He didn't give us the memo.
Yes, exactly. They didn't mention that to you. They never mentioned it to the people like myself. I used to go to court. And
we spent $10 million to figure that out.
Yes, which they could have just told you, hey, it's corrupt, this is the way it's going.
Wouldn't have to waste the money.
Nowadays, your lawyer knows when you find out who the case is going before, the judge is going before, pretty much what the outcome is going to be. That's how corrupt our system is. And Facebook was so corrupt, people may find this hard to believe, that it is a social psyops experiment. It is trying to manipulate people, not trying, it has.
Well, Sean Parker just admitted it.
Sean Parker
That's
admitted
the first admission that I have seen about Facebook.
Yes, and we know, particularly because we've studied this thoroughly, that silent subliminal control has so many aspects that simply flashing colors on a screen can actually cause a dopamine release in your brain. It can cause you to actually have ecstasy. Also, the flashing of the screen, if done another way, can cause you to have a cortisol reaction where your adrenals actually release adrenaline because you're going into shock. So in between pleasure and shock. That's
well,
what
have
he
you
was
seen?
describing.
Have you seen on the? I've looked at people's use of Facebook, and you see all these things popping up at the bottom, all these messages popping up all over the place. Now you and others have informed me more about this dopamine hit, which I had known, but not the actual science of it. That was all stuff we intentionally designed not to do, because I came out of goal setting, team building, time management, and I knew that when people are constantly interrupted, they can't get any work done. And so what Parker admitted is we want to keep that moving so much that you won't ever get off the site. That's not the point of a technology that's serving human beings. That is a technology that's trying to enslave human beings, in my view.
It's a drug. They now say that addiction to Facebook is worse than crack cocaine.
Wow.
They also state that there are numerous illnesses that are created by it. Plus, there is a scourge in America right now. There is actually many children who are going blind because they're looking at their screens in the dark. Adults too. This is not talked about.
It's sad.
It's not talked about the brain cancer that comes from holding the iPhone to your head. It's not talked
Right.
about all these different things. But one thing is for sure, we can see that the corruption with Facebook, it's not only Facebook, you've pointed out that many of these other groups, same exact scenario, but they had judges buying Facebook stock.
Right.
With insider trading.
Right.
And then those very judges come to be the judges who are in control of that case. Well, we also know that Facebook had Russian influence, Russian investment.
Right.
We also know that NSA and the CIA, FBI work all through it. This is well known. We know that the Russians had ads that were placed. We know that the Department of Defense, Board of Broadcasting Governors, and the Global Engagement Center uses Facebook to simply put in a query, target you, and then attack you, and that it can manipulate you beyond your imagination. Well, we have heard how there's meddling in the election. The real meddling in the election, I did not know until you told me this, that Eric Schmidt project created in 2008 was to manipulate Google and Facebook so that Obama would win. 2016, it was manipulated so Hillary would win. Eric Schmidt admits this. Facebook doesn't admit it. They try to act like they're innocent. But in fact, there was an Obama agency created called the U.S. Digital Service, which took Eric Schmidt's template to win.
They actually, in the Hillary emails, they actually called it initially the Eric Schmidt Project.
And the template to win.
And then Eric Schmidt put in $1.5 billion, and it was run out of the White House by a Google manager called Mikey Dickerson. And at the same time, Barack Obama's chief technology officer, Todd Y. Park, went out to California on loan, which the last time I read the Hatch Act is illegal. And he began helping the Hillary campaign out in California through his associations with Facebook. So it really became clear that they were sure that they were going to rig this election, this last election.
Which is just remarkable because that's the opposite story that we hear. And then to find out that a $1.5 billion was spent in a war room that basically controlled the social networking.
There are White House videos showing this group. And you never see anything in the press about the U.S. Digital Service.
The U.S. Digital Service, why didn't they call it the Democratic Digital Fraud Service? Because that would have been a much more accurate nomenclature.
Well, as an American, again, all this election fraud is not what I signed up for, and every citizen in this country needs to be incensed The court of public, if the courts are not going to protect us, then the court of public opinion needs to step up.
And the funny remark here, the last one I'll make, is that Facebook...
Well, I have a question for you, so go ahead.
Facebook used a Russian programmer to create the template to win. The Eric Schmidt project was written by a Russian, one of the #1 programmers for Facebook. So if you want to talk about Russian meddling in the election, you'd have to say yes, a Russian wrote the program, and Obama ran the program, and it was certainly to have Hillary put into the White House.
His name was on GSA contracts that were also found in Hillary's private email server.
Which you broke not just a few weeks ago, where these are government contracts where she paid $750,000 in 7 payments so that this program would be implemented on Facebook. We have the actual document. So is that not treasonous? I don't know another name for it besides treason, because it was worse than meddling in an election. It was an absolute fraud. It was complete collusion with the Russians, complete collusion with enemies of the state who are actually inside the state. So people get ripped off all the time.
Right. Well, let me ask you a question about getting ripped off.
Okay.
I hear that a little bird tells me that you had something to do with the whole Star Wars trilogy. Is that true?
I didn't know you spoke bird language.
I did. This bird just...
well, I can't believe we're quite drifting on this, but I will answer your questions because you've been so kind to answer all of my questions.
You guys came down here, so I want to find out about this Star Wars thing, because my whole family's been wrapped up in Star Wars through multiple generations.
Well, it's an interesting story. I, in my life, have come across some peculiar circumstances. I was studying to be a Waldorf teacher at an institute that trains Waldorf teachers. It's a private school system. And my boss came in and said, "I want you to come out here and talk with this lady." And I said, "Okay, whatever." So I came out of the bookshop and I went, and here was Marcia Lucas. Of course,
George Lucas's what?
Yes,
wife?
Yes, who people don't understand. She's the one who got the Oscar because she was the greatest and most cutting-edge film editor in Hollywood at the time. And George married her. They had worked on one of his movies together, American Graffiti, I believe. But she was also very famous. She'd worked with many of the great producers and directors out there. So I come into this room, and my boss and my other boss at the time, we sit down, and we're with Marcia Lucas. And my boss says, this is my student. I don't know what he introduced me as, but he's going to take care of all of your needs. I said, oh, wow. I don't even know why I'm here, so I'm going to take care of your needs. So then he excuses himself, walks out of the room, and my other boss says, well, you're not going to need me because I don't have anything to do with this kind of stuff. So,
so he leaves you there by
yourself.
yourself?
So he leaves me there, and there's 2 other people there. They didn't speak the whole time. For 3 days, we took George Lucas's script that had been rejected twice. He had a contract to make 2 movies, 2 science fiction movies, after he'd done American Graffiti and done another science fiction movie that was so horrible that it was a complete flop. But he had these contracts, and so he had submitted 2 different treatments, screenplays, and they rejected them wholesale. So Marcia Lucas had turned to my boss, whose name was Werner Glass, who ran this teacher training institute, because she had sent her children to the Waldorf school, and they're into storytelling, and they're into all this nice stuff. So she said, well, I should turn to them. So she came to Detroit, where we were, sat down with her, and when she read me this treatment, I found, you can read these treatments. As a matter of fact, the guy who wrote the true history of Star Wars has been in communication with me. He's writing a 4th book, not with George Lucas, this time to reveal...
Well, we've never heard of you before.
No, you've not heard of me. That's because I did that gratis. I was paid nothing for it, and I was happy to give my ideas. But basically, what really happened was I'm looking at this screenplay, this treatment. It was horrible. The names are horrible. It was all childish. It was pathetic. There was no plot. It was all about kyber crystals and about a guy and a girl who fight over kyber crystals, and then you get the kyber crystal and you win the day. It's like really,
You mean
really,
it's sort of overproduced tech?
It was bad tech. It was worse than a B-grade movie. They rejected it twice, okay? That's how bad it was. So she said, help us with this. So I said, well, first off, the story, there's no plot. So let's... what I get here is that George Lucas started writing a children's story when he was very young, And Chewbacca was his dog, of course, and so these characters were his childhood characters, and he was a guy who went out in space and was a space cowboy. Really a bad plot. Had no spiritual intent, had no resolve. It wasn't a true schemata. It wasn't a complete story. So I said to her, well, Marcia, I think what you really want is an adult fairy tale, a space fairy tale that's going to be a musical, because it was supposed to be an opera. People don't even realize it was a space musical opera. That's the reason John Williams was hired. But anyway, I said, I think what you want is a fairy tale. Yeah, he's incredible and did a great job on it. And by the way, George Lucas and Marcia, all of them, they did a great job on most of it. Of course, I have complaints because they didn't follow the story, and so they changed some very principal things. For instance, Yoda was never even supposed to be a Jedi warrior. He was comic relief. Alec Guinness was going to be the one to train the young Jedi, not Yoda. And then when Yoda started, picking up a lightsaber and trying to kill people, that was about the end for me, because Obi-Wan Kenobi was, again, they weren't supposed to use their weapons to attack. Their weapons were also shields, and when you attack them, their shield would then send back the energy to the person who sent it. Could never miss. You attack a Jedi warrior, you're dead. They didn't attack you. They didn't, because what I did is I took the stories from all the best books and the best versions of stories I've ever heard, made it into a fairy tale, basically. And also, just like, basically, Dorothy and her three characters, that's thinking, feeling, and willing. So The Wizard of Oz is, in fact, a fairy tale. And it's the same type of fairy tale that we turned that into.
So who wrote that book, The Power of Myth?
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell. Now, I saw his interviews with Bill Moyers, and I think everybody, like me, has got the impression that he came up with this storyline. You're saying that's not true?
No, and he didn't use Joseph Campbell either. He now has said, when he sold the company to Disney for $4.5 billion, and also he had made $4.5 billion off of merchandising, which he's the real genius at. No one has ever done anything like that. It's been in the stores continuously.
Invested in much of it.
As a matter of fact, your grandchildren are dressed up like that.
Exactly, just the other day, Halloween.
Everywhere you go, everywhere. You can't go anywhere that you don't see this merchandising, right? Well, that's the genius of him. His wife was a genius with editing, film editing, and basically the story was a good story because it's a completely integrated story. They left the end off, and that's the reason they're still struggling with 3 more movies, and they don't have a good completion. They don't have a good end because they forgot, they drifted off, because every fairy tale.
So, I know a little bit about intellectual property law and especially copyright law, and when people contribute primary content like this to a work, they have to be given credit. I mean, if you don't give credit to somebody who's contributed to your intellectual property, that's called inequitable conduct. It's a fancy lawyer word for fraud. So I don't get it. Why isn't your name come up anywhere?
Well, because what I didn't tell you is that Waldorf education, and I was a Waldorf teacher, we don't believe in movies. We don't let the students watch movies. We don't let them watch television. So when I helped, it was to try to bring our side of storytelling up onto the silver screen.
Well, it doesn't really matter what you believe. It's about what the law says, that if you are a contributor to a copyright, you have to be given credit.
I was not given any credit, and I did it for free, and I did it out of just trying to help, and I worked for 3 days, and I didn't think much about it. About a year, I don't remember, sometime after that, when the movie started to come out, Marcia contacted my boss and said, all Waldorf schools we will give them a copy of the movie, and they can play this movie in a theater as a fundraiser before it ever opens.
I see.
So they offered us what should have been millions and millions of dollars.
That's nice, but it's still not copyright law.
And what did Waldorf schools do? Rejected that offer because we don't believe in movies.
Wow.
So
that doesn't really matter, by the way.
I know what you're saying is so right, and I'm going to say one more thing, and that's that Marcia then turned Kathleen Kennedy, Spielberg's assistant, who now is as big as Spielberg and producing and directing in movies. And she called, and I talked to her on the phone, and for years I was in a conversation with her, a long conversation, about the Indiana Jones movies because she actually became the person in charge.
So you were in that too?
Those came from me. All those stories came from me.
Oh, wow. Gee,
but
you're blowing my mind
except for the Nazis and all the stupid Nazi stuff. But the content of the fairy tale story that's found in each of the Indiana Jones, I was paid for that, $100 an hour. And I sold her huge amounts of books, which then went into the Skywalker Ranch library. So if you don't believe my story, go look, you'll see the Mayflower Bookshop. Now, we were given credit, so I'm throwing this out to ask your opinion. At the end of all the Indiana Jones movies, they say the last credit they give is, and special thanks to Mayflower Light and Production, I think they call it. We made up a name because I worked at the Mayflower Bookshop, and so my boss at the bookshop said, we'll call it Mayflower Light or whatever. So they did give us credit in the first time that I'd see these movies, and then it was removed, and it was no longer at the bottom. So they paid me $100 an hour, and I talked to her for hundreds and hundreds of hours as we worked through the plots of these movies. And then she came and visited us, and so I met with her, and I never got to meet Spielberg, never got to meet Lucas, but I do know that the Skywalker Ranch is chock full of all those books. But then I had to distill it into something like a third grade level. So I took the entire Grail story and turned it into a fairy tale, which could be told in less than a minute. That was that. So each of those, even the last Indiana Jones movie was actually taken from a story I'd already written called Sunbirth. So I worked with them, but I thought I was just trying to be helpful. And I was naive. I know nothing about patents or what you're telling me about. I'm only learning this by looking at your case. So yes, it is true that industrial espionage is out there. They will steal every idea you have. That's a fact. They'll steal your patents. The government will even do it and call it legal. Yeah. And I guess the lesson to learn here is when you share your intellectual property, even when it's as simple as telling somebody a fairy tale that they use and turn into a movie, I guess we have to be very careful about that.
Well, if somebody's intent on stealing your stuff, they're going to figure a way to do it, and they'll just pay more lawyers to write more crap. And the principle is your property is your property. And my property is my property. That's the constitutional principle. Not in a socialist world. In the world my friends from the Soviet Union were in, nothing was their property. And we now know what happened to that. They collapsed. We're headed that way, I think. But back to your situation, I think that if you made a contribution, you need proper credit because that's the way the law prescribes it. If they're trying to ignore you, that's a different issue. If they paid you and they think that absolves them, no, it doesn't.
Well, it's interesting because this only really came out when I wrote an article that then got printed in a Waldorf school in their newsletter. And at the top, they put a banner. And in that banner, it said, oh, this proves what we always heard as a rumor, that George Lucas sent his children to the Waldorf school, and that somehow the Waldorf school and what's called anthroposophy, the philosophy of Waldorf schools, is somehow behind Star Wars. And so they printed that. Well, George Lucas's publicist contacted that school and said, we are going to sue you because George Lucas did not send his children to the Waldorf school. They were Marcia's children. Yeah. And George Lucas was the sole inspirer, and George Lucas, the two things in the banner were false. So he threatened to sue them. So they retracted it.
Sure, typical bully conduct.
But they read my whole article that describes everything I'm describing to you in great detail.
Yeah,
and they did not threaten me, so I know that he knows that it's the truth because he would have threatened me if it wasn't. And the same thing with the Indiana Jones, because remember, Lucas and Spielberg were linked after the second Star Wars movie all the way through to the end of the Indiana Jones movies. And Kathleen Kennedy ran both those companies for them. And that's who I talk with so often, right? So really, when it comes down to it, George Lucas has based.
Interesting. Wow, you've been screwed too.
Yes, I just like the book that you want to print about your experience called
Screwed.
Screwed. Yeah, because you were innocent and I was innocent, and really I didn't care. Right. And so I guess I was taken advantage of.
Well, this isn't the way our country's supposed to operate. We got to get back to the way our system was designed and the brilliance of our founders, and we just got to do it. And all this abuse of people is wrong.
Well, here's what I suggest, since you brought this up. I suggest everyone listening to this needs to inform George Lucas he needs to send me a check.
There you go.
And then I'm going to turn around and give that check to you so that you can, in fact, continue to fund your legal case here. As a matter of fact, I wanted to ask this, and it's nowhere in our conversations that I've noted this. Is there any way people can legally, financially help you in your legal battle? You don't have, like everyone else, a thing at the bottom where you can donate anywhere, do you? Or you don't have a website?
Our shareholders are helping now, and if somebody wanted to, yeah, we would welcome support. But I don't have anything formal on our website right now. They would just have to send the check to us at our office.
I believe that if your case wins, one way or the other, whether it's executive action or lawsuit or whatever, it will absolutely transform America, because all the people involved in your situation will then also be held accountable for their other crimes when we start to lift the blinders from our eyes.
There's a lot of people that have been abused by this system.
Absolutely. Well, I guess I'm in the same bit of a boat
Yes,
with you.
you are. Sounds like it.
I guess we just got to keep bailing and keep these boats afloat.
Exactly.
Thank you for the conversation, Michael.
You're welcome.